pre-dawn gloom over the Meuse River Valley in August 1914 concealed the outlines of what would soon forever change humanity's understanding of war. In the silence, broken only by the lapping water and the rare cries of birds, concrete giants slept. 12 forts encircling the ancient city of Liège. These structures, which seemed to contemporaries to be the pinnacle of engineering thought, stood as unshakable guardians of neutrality, a guarantee that a small nation would not simply become a thoroughfare for foreign armies. Inside the armored cupolas, duty crews peered into the fog, awaiting the inevitable, though reason refused to believe in the reality of what was happening. Just a few days earlier, Europe lived in the illusion of diplomatic balance. And now, on the horizon, where the sky met the earth, a steel cloud began to gather. The commander of the defense, General Gérard Lehmann, a man of the old school and iron principles, understood that his garrison was to become the first stumbling block for the continent's most powerful war machine. He did not know then that it was here, at the junction of borders, that the era of romantic bayonet charges and cavalry raids would be buried, giving way to a cold, mathematically precise industry of destruction. The air trembled not from sound, but from pressure, as the first advanced detachments of the German army crossed the invisible borderline. This was not just an invasion. It was a clash of two epochs. Liège was not just a city. It was a geographical bolt, a narrow bottleneck through which the German General Staff planned to pour an ocean of its troops into the vastness of France. The plan, developed by the late Count von Schlieffen, was not merely a strategy, but a peculiar cult of speed. In this doctrine, time was valued more than gold and human lives. Every delay, every hour of idleness before the closed gates of the Belgian fortresses meant that on the other side of Europe, the vast and unwieldy Russian Empire gained precious time for mobilization. Therefore, for Germany, Liège was not an end in itself. It was an annoying obstacle that had to be swept away with one decisive blow, without stopping for long sieges. German commanders, raised on the triumphs of the year 70 of the 19th century, were convinced that psychological pressure and a show of force would be enough. They believed that the sight of gray uniforms and the gleam of bayonets would force the defenders to lay down their arms. This was a fatal error of judgment, based on the arrogance of a great power towards a small neighbor. No one in Berlin could have imagined that King Albert's refusal to allow troops passage was not merely a diplomatic gesture, but an expression of national will, ready for sacrifice. Belgian neutrality, guaranteed by international treaties, transformed from a legal concept into a sacred principle worth fighting for. When the German emissary presented an ultimatum demanding free passage, the answer was brief and full of dignity. Belgium is a state, not a road. This answer set in motion a mechanism that could no longer be stopped. In the headquarters of France and Great Britain, they held their breath. For Paris, every minute of Liège's resistance meant an opportunity to regroup forces and prepare for the strike. For London, the violation of Belgian neutrality became the moral casus belli that tipped the scales in favor of entering the conflict. Russia, observing events from the east, accelerated the movement of its echelons, understanding that the fate of their allies was being decided right now, in these first hours and days, at the walls of the old forts. The first blow was struck with haste, dictated by overconfidence. The German command, striving to maintain a strict schedule, threw infantry units into an attack directly between the forts, hoping to slip through them with a daring assault. This was a decision dictated by the logic of wars of the last century. when the bravery of the soldier and the density of the formation decided the outcome of the battle. But Liège was defended not just by walls, but by crossfire. As soon as the gray waves of attackers emerged into the open, they encountered the reality of the 20th century. Belgian machine guns and artillery zeroed in on every square of the terrain, opened a hurricane of fire. The advancing ranks melted like wax under a blowtorch. Eyewitnesses described how entire battalions disappeared in smoke and flames without having fired a shot. It was a slaughter where human flesh collided with the mechanized efficiency of the defense. Instead of a triumphant march, the German army received mountains of bodies before the Belgian breastworks. The shock of this first clash was colossal. The myth of the invincibility of the Prussian war machine cracked in the very first hours. It turned out that spirit and discipline were powerless against a well-organized system of fire and concrete. However, behind the outward facade of fierce firefights lay a deeper, internal conflict. In General Lehmann's headquarters, tension reigned, bordering on despair. He understood that his success was temporary. The forts, designed by the great engineer Brialmont at the end of the 19th century, were built to withstand the artillery of that time, shells up to 210 millimeters in caliber. But intelligence reported alarming rumors that the enemy was preparing something monstrous, a weapon capable of cracking concrete like an eggshell. Lehmann was alone in his knowledge. His garrison, encouraged by initial successes, believed in the impregnability of their positions. The general had to maintain this morale, hiding the terrible truth that the isolation of the fortress was only a matter of time. The gaps between the forts were too great, and there was a catastrophic lack of infantry to cover them. Lehmann fought his internal battle, a battle between a commander's duty, obligated to hold the defense to the last, and the understanding that he was sending his men to an inevitable slaughter to buy time for the Allies. Every hour that Liège held was paid for with the lives of its defenders, and this burden of responsibility weighed on the old soldier's shoulders, heavier than the concrete vaults of his command post. On the other side of the front line, drama was also unfolding in the German headquarters. General von Emich, commander of the combined army, was furious. His career and reputation hung by a thread. The offensive schedule was crumbling before his eyes. At this moment, a figure appeared who was destined to become one of the main protagonists of this war: Erich Ludendorff. Not yet a field marshal, but only the deputy chief of staff of the army, he showed the very initiative that distinguishes outstanding tacticians. Seeing that frontal attacks were faltering and troop control was lost in the chaos of night combat, Ludendorff personally led one of the brigades. He acted unconventionally, infiltrating between the forts, using the terrain and darkness. In a daring impulse, he and his adjutant rode up to the gates of the citadel of the city of Liège and, knocking on the gates with the hilt of his sword, demanded the surrender of the garrison. It was an act of incredible psychological audacity. The defenders, disoriented by rumors of a breakthrough and panic in the city, succumbed to this pressure. The city fell, but the ring of forts around it continued to fight. This episode showed that even in the age of machines, the personal will and audacity of a commander can change the course of events. But it did not solve the strategic problem. The forts continued to control the railways, and German trains with supplies and reinforcements stood in miles-long traffic jams at the border. The ideological conflict unfolding near Liège extended far beyond military strategy. It was a clash of two philosophies. On one side, faith in the inviolability of treaties, the rights of small nations, and the static nature of defense. On the other, the philosophy of might makes right, technological determinism, and the dynamics of offense. For Belgium and observing France, the defense of Liège was a symbol that spirit was more important than matter. For Germany, it was proof that no moral obstacles could stop the necessity of national survival, as they understood it. The paradox was that both sides were right in their logic, and this made the conflict irresolvable by peaceful means. The technological aspect of this ideological confrontation was no less important. Liège became a testing ground where the theory of fortress warfare was put to the test. Until this moment, it was believed that a well-fortified fortress could hold out for months, tying up enormous enemy forces. Military theorists across Europe watched Liège as an experiment. If the forts held, it meant the entire concept of blitzkrieg was impossible. If they fell quickly, it meant the era of fortresses was over forever. It was at this moment, when the situation seemed to be at a stalemate, the Germans controlled the city, but the forts blocked the roads, that a transformation occurred that changed everything. From deep within the German rear, monsters began to arrive by rail, their existence long considered mere rumors. These were the big Bertha siege mortars of 420 mm caliber and their Austrian sisters, Skoda mortars of 305 mm caliber. These weapons were a technological marvel and a curse of their time. Their transportation required colossal efforts, strengthening bridges and roads, but the effect of their deployment was devastating. The appearance of these giants on the positions marked the end of the 19th century and the final entry into the 20th. The sound of a Big Bertha firing was unlike anything heard before. It was a low, guttural roar, followed by the whistle of a nearly 1-ton shell ascending into the stratosphere. The ballistics of these weapons allowed shells to fall almost vertically onto the target, penetrating concrete ceilings and exploding deep inside the forts. When the first such shells struck one of the forts, the defenders experienced not just fear, but existential dread. Walls that seemed indestructible shattered into dust. Concrete blocks weighing tens of tons were tossed into the air like toys. The garrisons inside perished not so much from shrapnel as from the monstrous pressure differential and structural collapse. The forts of Liège, the pride of Belgian engineering, were turning into traps for their defenders. The psychological effect was instantaneous. Soldiers who bravely repelled infantry attacks found themselves powerless in the face of a threat from which there was no escape. This was war at a distance, where the enemy pressing the trigger did not see the faces of those he was destroying. Technology had finally triumphed over personal heroism. The culmination arrived with the bombardment of Fort Lonson, where General Lehmann's headquarters were located. On August 15th, the monster guns focused their fire on this last bastion of resistance. The methodical precision with which the German artillerymen destroyed the fort was terrifying in its cold efficiency. Shell after shell, with mathematical accuracy, they brought the denouement closer. The final chord was a direct hit on the fort's powder magazine. The explosion was so powerful that it was felt many kilometers from the epicenter. The massive concrete structure simply ceased to exist, turning into a heap of smoking ruins. When German soldiers entered the territory of the ruined fort, they found General Lehmann unconscious, pinned down by debris. He had not surrendered. He was incapacitated by the physical force of the explosion. His sword, which he refused to give to the victor, was returned to him as a sign of respect for his displayed courage. But it was a gesture from a fading era of chivalry, which looked strange against the lunar landscape created by modern artillery. The fall of the last fort on August 16th opened the way for the German army. But the price of this victory was strategically unacceptable. The delay at Liège amounted to more than 10 days. In the scale of ordinary life, this is a negligible period, but in the scale of the Schlieffen Plan, it was an eternity. During these 10 days, the British Expeditionary Force managed to land on the continent and begin its advance towards Mons. The French army completed mobilization and began troop redeployment. The Russian Empire, which the Germans considered a slow bear, began an offensive in East Prussia earlier than expected, forcing Berlin to withdraw 2 corps from the Western Front and send them to the east. These 2 corps may have been precisely the weight that Germany lacked for victory in the Battle of the Marne. Liège fell, but in its fall, it laid the foundation for Germany's future defeat. The myth of the Blitzkrieg stumbled at the very first threshold. The lessons of Liège echoed through all the staffs of Europe. France and Germany feverishly analyzed what had happened. For the French, it was a signal that their own fortresses were vulnerable, leading to dangerous decisions to disarm the forts of Verdun, which nearly cost them the war later on. For Germany, it was confirmation that brute force and heavy artillery were the key to success. But observers from other countries drew their own conclusions. In particular in the East, where future Polish military thought was forming, they closely watched the collapse of static defense. Polish officers, serving in various armies and dreaming of the revival of their homeland, saw in Liège proof that passive defense in fortresses was a path to defeat. The diametrically opposed tactics, which would later be applied in maneuver warfare in Eastern Europe, were born precisely from an analysis of the mistakes of the Western Front. If in the West the war froze in concrete and trenches, then in the eastern expanses, and later in the War of the 20th Year, the emphasis would be placed on maneuver, speed, and flanking attacks, avoiding frontal clashes with fortified points. Liège showed that sitting and waiting for a blow under a concrete dome means giving the initiative to the enemy, who will always have a larger caliber gun. This lesson in maneuver warfare, learned through the rejection of the Liège experience, would become the basis for the survival of regenerated Poland in its struggle with the Bolsheviks a few years later. The resonance of the events of August 1914 is still felt today. The Battle of Liège became a prologue to the world we live in now. It showed that technological progress without moral control leads to monstrous destruction. It demonstrated that even a small force with determination and readiness for self-sacrifice can break the plans of a giant. It was a lesson that in war, there is no pure mathematics. There is always a human factor, a variable that cannot be calculated in staff equations. The heroism of the defenders of Liège became a moral tuning fork for the entire Entente. Allied propaganda used the image of raped Belgium, in the figurative political sense of a violation of sovereignty, to mobilize society. This transformed the war from a dispute between ministerial cabinets into a people's war, where the values of civilization were at stake. Moreover, Liège became a point of no return for military architecture. After the world saw photographs of shattered forts, faith in impregnable walls wavered, though it did not disappear completely, resurfacing later in the form of the Maginot Line, another great illusion whose roots lie in those August days. The paradox is that humanity, having seen the futility of static defense in the face of powerful weapons, instead of abandoning wars, began a new round of the arms race, striving to create an even more powerful shield and an even more devastating sword. Liège taught military men that nothing is eternal under the sun, especially if that sun illuminates the sight of a 420mm howitzer. When the dust over the ruins of Fort Longchamp finally settled, and the last shots died down, silence once again reigned over the Meuse Valley. But this was no longer the peaceful, sleepy silence that had prevailed here at the beginning of August. This was the silence of a graveyard, a silence of conclusion and, at the same time, of a terrible beginning. Germany had passed through Liège, but it had lost the innocence of its strategy. The plan for a quick war, scheduled down to the minute, failed in its very first act. General Lehmann, pulled from under the rubble, lost his battle but won something greater. He won time, that very resource which cannot be replenished. Europe stepped into the abyss of a world conflict, and the first step into that abyss was the siege of Liège. In historical perspective, these few days became the grain of sand that, entering the perfectly lubricated mechanism of the German war machine, ultimately led to its halt after 4 long and bloody years. A century later, walking through the grass-covered hills that conceal the remnants of exploded concrete, it is difficult to imagine the hell that unfolded here. But if you listen closely, through the sound of the wind, you can hear the echo of those distant events, the screech of metal, the roar of explosions, and the silent cry of an old world dying under the blows of a new century. The history of Liège is a reminder that any, even the most perfect, strategy shatters against the reality of the human spirit and the unpredictability of war. And as long as there are borders and ambitions, the lesson of Liège will remain relevant. There are no walls capable of protecting from the future if minds and hearts are not ready for it. The wheel of history, having turned in the 14th year, continues to rotate, and each new conflict forces us to return again and again to those days when Europe first looked down the barrel of Big Bertha and realized that the world would never be the same. In this cyclical return to the beginning, we find bitter wisdom. Technological power is limitless, but the outcome of history is decided by people, their will, and their readiness to stand to the end, even when the heavens fall to earth.